what often gets interpreted as a motivation problem. What would happen if we actually treated it like a mismatch problem instead? And I think that this is a less pathologizing approach, and it's kinder and ultimately more helpful.
Welcome to the Self-Carapist Podcast. Join me, Lorraine Moorhead, a licensed psychotherapist, clinical supervisor, and EMDR consultant, along with expert guests as we explore the approaches and modalities we've used and developed to support our clients' success. Our conversations and stories are designed to inspire new and seasoned clinicians to stay curious, prioritize self-care, and never stop learning. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Hurst Bush, co-author of the Motivation Mindset Workbook, who expands upon the understanding of motivation through the APT framework. We discuss aptitude, pleasure, and practice, and how therapists can help families move away from thoughts of concern of laziness and into a more curious and hopeful mindset. This conversation discusses 3 items that can be overlooked when it comes to motivation and includes lots of examples and scenarios. For anyone thinking about goals this resolution season, this episode might be a great place to start as you consider how to tap into motivation that lasts. Welcome, Dr. Hurst Bush.
Hi, Lorraine. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you. Today, we're going to talk about a couple of neat things, your history in the field and an exciting new workbook that you have coming out.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to talk about all of the above.
Can you just start by explaining how the workbook came about and how your role in the workbook?
Absolutely. So the Motivation Mindset Workbook, which is due to be released on December 8th by Guilford Press, it is largely informed by a book that was published back in 2023 by Dr. Braaten. That book is called Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less, and it's a book largely looking at children's motivation and the lack of motivation. And I have worked closely with Dr. Braaten for close to 10 years at this point, and I'm such a fan of her work, and it's amazing to get to work with someone you admire so much. And her book, this latest book, Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less, really resonated with me. I saw a lot of myself in my previous experiences and times in my life where I have not felt very motivated in her pages. And I thought that she had created something incredible. I wanted to make it even more accessible and to help her get it into even more hands. So that's where I pitched to her the idea of creating a workbook. And we together pitched the idea of a workbook to her publishers at Guilford Press, and it worked. That's how the Motivation Mindset came to be. That was a couple of years ago, and it's just so exciting to be on the cusp of its release and this exciting thing we've worked so hard on to be out in the world soon.
One of the things I love about the original book, Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less, is I really think it sort of changes how we're approaching motivation. I think probably you and I and anyone listening probably has experienced clients, teenagers, kids, and adults who wouldn't say that they feel motivated and they may not feel that they have a passion. So it seems like this book gives more ideas on how to support that rather than I had someone recently say, having one tool, which is a hammer, and using that. I feel like it gives a lot of different tools.
Thank you. That's definitely the goal. And over time, there have been many theories, very solid theories, put out there by very smart folks to explain why we do the things we do. And also to try to explain what happens when we don't do the things we want to do or need to do. And Dr. Braaten, I think, expands on the existing theories, all of which are solid, but none of which fully explains the complexities of human motivation. She builds off of those to give us one more, and in Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less, it's called the Motivation App, or sometimes called the Parenting App too. And app is an acronym because psychologists love acronyms. So in this case, APP stands for thinking about pleasure, and thinking about practice and letting those guide us around motivation, especially when it comes to children and teens. This is a model that, again, doesn't explain everything. I don't think we're ever going to have a one-stop shop when it comes to a theory that explains everything about human motivation. But I do think Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less gives us a new, very interesting, very applicable one that gives us tools to work with when we think about aptitude, pleasure, and practice and how they interact.
Yeah. Can you explain each one? For example, starting with aptitude, how does it affect someone if they don't seem to have a natural aptitude? How does it work in balance with the other two?
Absolutely. Aptitude is a great place to start. So, aptitude we think of as being someone's abilities, where they are right now, and also what those abilities could look like at some point in the future. So, it's, I guess, in a single word, it's skill. And I feel bad when skill gets talked about as a fixed trait. I get sad when any of these things, aptitude, pleasure, practice, motivation all together, get talked about like they're these fixed things that you either have or you don't. We know better than that. Each one of them is fluid, aptitude included. Sometimes there's a lot of overlap between what you're good at, right? What skills come easily, naturally, and what you enjoy doing. That's the tie into pleasure that we'll talk about soon. But it's also a muscle. And that's something that we really try to impart to our readers in the Motivation Mindset Workbook, that aptitude is a muscle and it's certainly not fixed. And there are things you can do like practice, tying into another part of the model, that can actually make your aptitude stronger.
We'll just skip pleasure just for a second because you already mentioned practice. Can you talk about what we might expect to see with practice? I think a lot of maybe our perspectives coming up was we should be really putting in the reps. And, a lot of us probably remember what that felt like to be told, no, you have to go practice for another hour and because you signed up for it. And so what would be an ideal way to sort of look at practice?
I think there are a few different ways of thinking about practice and a few different ways that we think about it in the Motivation Mindset Workbook. So on one level, practice is doing the thing, right? It's actually stepping up to the plate, initiating and doing the thing. But it also has to do with having the time to do the thing. And some of the activities in the workbook have to do with clearing one's schedule or making time in one's schedule and protecting that time so that the practice actually has a chance to happen. Because without that time, the practice probably doesn't get a chance because there are so many competing demands on our time, including the time of children and the time of teens.
Yeah. Yeah. If there is enough time available and there's downtime and a child has access to think, oh, I'm kind of bored, or I think I'll work on this, it helps. If it has to be fit in the schedule, one of many things, then it's just not feasible to do.
That's right. And the activities in the practice chapter of the Motivation Mindset Workbook are, of course, informed by personal experience. They're informed by research. They're informed by clinical work. But there's so much of me and my soul and my experience, and Ellen's too, that are infused into the activities. Can I share a really quick story?
Please do. I was going to ask if you were illuminate what tied you to this work personally.
Absolutely, because when I say that motivation is not a fixed trait, it is variable, it ebbs and flows. There are so many factors that go into it and can affect it. I'm talking about me. And one of the most vivid times in my life where I really, really struggled with motivation, and it felt like a crisis at the time. I went to a high school that had really, really demanding summer projects for our English classes. And this was actually a really great thing. I say with 25 plus years perspective on it. I'm like, this was great that we had to do a summer project that was so executively demanding, that had so many different components, things like reading multiple books like the Odyssey and the Iliad and writing essays about them, but also keeping a journal and writing daily for a month, and also going to an art performance, like a art gallery, going to a live theater, just doing all of these things that culminated in this really intense, well fleshed out, easily 100-page English summer assignment. I can say now, as someone who has a PhD, it was not as much work as a dissertation, but I think it was more work than my master's degree. It was
Wow.
wild. And here's the thing. We knew about this project at the beginning of the summer, and it had been a requirement to a lesser degree for lesser grades. It was that in that way developmentally appropriate, but we knew about it because we had done one every summer in years past. We knew about it before the end of the current school year. We knew exactly when it was due, but during the summers, I worked 40 hours a week in McDonald's, and I loved it. I loved working at McDonald's, and there's so much of what I learned there that I have brought with me into every role and every job I've had since then. But 40 hours a week is working full time. And one could argue that doing all of the different components of the summer project was working full time too. And long story short, I didn't have my report ready for the first day of school. And there was major tears, major crunch time, major crisis. I
Yeah.
remember the hives.
My
I remember
gosh.
the hives because I waited too long. I
Yeah.
didn't do the thing. I did not step up to the plate, but in large part, not because I didn't care. I cared a lot about being a good student and doing the things I was supposed to do and doing a good job. But I was really tired from having worked 40 hours a week. And that was a very, I think, crisp example where it wasn't an aptitude issue. It wasn't
No.
even a pleasure issue because I love to read and write. I love to go to the art museum and
Yeah.
theater. I love these things. It was really a practice issue and not having time for it. If I could go
Yeah.
back to that summer, there are things I know I would have tweaked and would have done differently. But of course, with the hindsight of an almost 40-year-old.
Yeah, that is such a good point. I'm thinking of clients. I work with a lot of high achieving adults, and actually, a lot of them identify with ADHD traits, and they've got a system down. Many people that I talk to, where they procrastinate just enough to have that push of dopamine to be able to get a project done. But to your point, if you miscalculate, if your cursory glance of your summer project assignment tells you you need 10 hours less than you do by the time that you start, those hours aren't there.
That's what happens. That's what happens. So I guess in some ways it was a practice issue, but as we'll talk about, aptitude, pleasure, and practice, they're not so distinct. They really do travel together. I'm thinking right now about the CBT triangle, about how thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, we know that these influence one another. We can talk about them like they're distinct, but they flow so fluidly that talking about them like they're these totally separate entities doesn't always do us a good service. I think something similar is probably happening for aptitude, pleasure, and practice, because in what I was just describing, it was a practice issue, but maybe I misunderestimated my aptitude and my ability to do things very well and very quickly because I missed the mark.
It makes a lot of sense. Even that analogy makes a lot of sense that happens so often in talking about that triangle that you start out with one and you're easily into the other two because they do work in such a synthesis together. So to close our triangle, can you share a bit about pleasure?
Yes, pleasure, I think, is probably the most face valid of the three constructs that make up the app with aptitude, pleasure, and practice. Pleasure is doing what feels good, but also having a knowledge and an understanding of what your pleasures are. Pleasure is for everybody. Pleasure sometimes gets talked about like a dirty word. Like sometimes that's a word that just makes people go like, what did you say? But I don't think it should be. I think it's really important. It really is for everybody. And sometimes it takes exploring. It takes exploring to know what our pleasures are. What are the things that make us feel good when we do them? We might think we know, but sometimes there's untapped pleasures out there. We might be doing things that are pleasure adjacent. And a lot of the activities in the workbook are in the spirit of identifying the current pleasures, but also looking at ways of trying and expanding that set.
One thing that stands out to me that I felt will really resonate with people was to imagine having that conversation with a teenager and they say, I don't really enjoy anything. The only thing I like is video games. And there's a statement in the book that a video game actually might not be pleasure at all. It is and in the same way that for us as adults, doom scrolling at the end of the night might not actually be a pleasurable activity. It's just one that you're familiar with. It kind of creates a numbness that feels good to allow you an opportunity not to be thinking about the problems and other things that have come up during the day, but it may not, those both may not be a pleasurable activity.
That's a really good point. I do agree with that. I do think that it's context dependent and probably
Yeah.
individual dependent, because for some folks, I'm thinking about some teens who are envisioning a career in gaming.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean not being a streamer, although people do that and are wildly successful at it.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the kids who like making their own games, right? Who
Mhm.
are interested in game development. For that kind of kid, playing video games probably is pleasure, right? If it's lending itself to creativity and a possible career and a possible future, if it's connecting that
Problem
child,
solving.
there's a lot of visual spatial skills. There's
Mhm.
there's a lot there. I love video games. My bias is showing. But at the same time, for the kid, we've talked about one kid who lives in one house. For the kid who lives next door, video games might not be serving a pleasure function. They might be serving an escape function. That's different. Pleasure is really meant to be something genuine and something that can't be faked and is top tier, not second tier.
Can you talk about how an individual's values might actually help them find their pleasure if it's not the activity itself?
Absolutely. I feel like this question lends itself to acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And it's so funny because obviously we're a product of our training, right? A product of our training and our experiences. And when I was working on this book with Ellen, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, was really the main orientation or the main approach that I was drawing from in doing my therapy work in my independent practice with my patients. And writing a workbook is not a short thing to do. It's a very long
Mm.
thing to do. This has been in development for years at this
Oh,
point.
wow. Yeah.
And over the course of writing and editing this workbook, I've become way more invested. Have found myself adding a lot of ACT into the work that I do. And the workbook, I do think, is rooted in CBT, but there's a lot of connection to ACT as well. And the question you're asking, do values give us a lifeline on identifying pleasures? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. One of the things Ellen suggests in Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less, and we also delve into and develop in the Motivation Mindset Workbook, is the idea of gratitude, because I think gratitude and values have some interesting overlaps, both of which have interesting overlaps and connections to pleasure. And oftentimes, the things that we're grateful for are often the things that give us pleasure. And the things that we are grateful for and are trying to cultivate, those are the things that often give us a read on our values. So there's a difference between values and goals, but values and the things we care about, the things that mean something to us, that are worth showing up for, that are worth doing, those absolutely lend themselves to a pleasure inventory, right? To collecting and trying different things that could bring us a lot of pleasure when we do them.
I loved that because I think for some families, when you're trying to think, well, Mike, it's not that tennis or gymnastics is really lighting my kid up, but they always want to go and they always want to go to Lego Club and they always want to go to the mall. And it's like, well, what are the common threads between all of those things? You know, maybe it's the opportunity to socialize. Maybe it's the opportunity to build connections. Maybe it's the exploration component. And so I just thought that was really, really neat because I think a mindset that someone might have come into this process with was they need one thing. Everybody should have that passion that they spend 10,000 hours getting great at. And I love that it can be like really just lighting the path to their getting in tune with their value and helping them really hone those skills from that perspective and not like one particular activity necessarily.
Right? Isn't hearing find your passion, isn't that a lot of pressure? I experienced that as a lot of pressure. And I
Yeah.
don't think passion has to be a singular thing. In the course of writing the Motivation Mindset Workbook, I read the book Range I think it's by David Epstein.
Hmm.
I know Epstein is the last name. That makes the case for not finding your passion, if you will, but trying a lot of things, being exposed to a lot of different things and letting that enrich you and letting
Yeah.
that enrich your skills. And sometimes that is an approach like with kids, with teens who might look unmotivated. Sometimes that's the better fit than finding this singular passion that they may or may not have. It might be a singular passion, and if you're lucky enough to stumble into it and identify it early in life and it's all you want to do, in some ways that's kind of an easy way to live. If it's just so crystal clear and identified so early on, but not having that either very early on or maybe never having that. In some ways, I think that can be a harder path, but arguably a more interesting one. If there's a silver lining to the latter path, it's that there might be more opportunities to try and explore and identify those other pleasures along the way.
Yeah. What are some of the ways that we as a child's system might diminish their ability to explore or even enjoy their passions?
What a wonderful question. I think one of the big threats that is very top of mind that I have to be mindful of both for myself when I'm planning my activities and also for my kids. I'm a parent to a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old.
And I
And
have a 6, so
you
we're right in
too.
right
We're
in a
living
row.
life great. My answer to this question is overscheduling.
Mhm.
And I don't think kids get overscheduled from a malicious place. What usually happens is that if kids get overscheduled, it's from a really well-intentioned place. There can be a real push to not miss any opportunities and not miss out FOMO. FOMO is
Mhm.
very real, and it can result in a very, very, very frenetic, very busy, pack tight schedule. And this is the threat, one of the big threats to having the breathing room, like the time, the space, and the energy to try a new thing when so much of the schedule, so much of the time is already claimed. Another threat to the system is the follow-through aspect. And I'll personally share, I'm a big fan of kids' activities that last for a season or last for a
Mm.
session or last for a quarter with the option to re-up and keep going or the option to stop and maybe not keep going. I get itchy with the activities that require like a whole year's commitment
Yeah, or indefinite.
or indefinite.
Yeah.
There's, I think, another threat to the system is that sunk cost fallacy that I've
Yes.
already started, right? We've already been doing these lessons. We've already been doing this thing. We've already invested a lot of time and money, like opportunity cost too, that we have not spent doing other things. So kind of this false notion that we're in it too deep and
Yeah.
we're not able to pause or pull back. We just have to keep going because we already started.
Yeah.
Those are, I would say those are some of the biggest threats, being overscheduled and this false belief that we're in too deep to change course. Those are the things that can make exploring new pleasures, trying new things, just a tricky thing to do.
Along the lines of the sunk cost fallacy, I love that. I think about that all the time. Is you hear parents say, I'm in Arizona, and I don't know if I see it as much here, but talking to people in the Midwest or some different areas with really built out sports programs, I think it feels like if your kid is starting an activity later than 4, then they're not going to get to this D1 level. And so there's this pressure, like in order to keep up with where the other kids are, you can't start a new activity at this age if you haven't started earlier. Or even the kids showing up, it feels like, well, these guys all really know the ins and outs of this sport and I'm just starting. And so there's that pressure too, maybe of this is our chance. This is the one that we started early, and so we have to stick with it too. Similar.
Like a stick with what you know mentality.
Mm-hmm.
I know I brought up the pressure aspect before of like find your passion and how pressuring that is. What you just described, which is very true. I'm based in Boston and I see this, feel this too.
Yeah.
Thinking about a 4-year-old playing D1 athletics.
Yeah.
Pressure much?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the really important considerations of all of this is, and I remember having this conversation with parents before I was one. And then it was so funny to see the fear-based mentality creep up, even knowing that it was there. But so often as parents, your kid doesn't nap for a couple days and it's like, oh, I guess we're not, I guess we're never sleeping again. I guess they're going to be in college, like up all night. It's so easy as a parent and probably evolutionary that we do this, but it's so easy to go to how they are right now as a young child is going to be how they are in their future. If they're not cleaning up right now, they're going to be a messy partner, messy roommate, and we can see some of that fear-based mentality leaching into the supposed to be pleasurable activities as well.
You're absolutely right, Lorraine. And again, this is not coming from a malicious place.
No.
Parents aren't bringing their kids to soccer clinics and traveling teams and summer program. Like they're not doing this because they're bad guys.
No.
Opposite, they're doing it because they're loving and doing what they know, right? Doing what they
Mm-hmm.
know. It's very much the water we swim in. You can't ignore the messaging in the water that we swim in. And the water we swim in gets informed by what other people are doing, like our peers, right? The folks who are in the same stage of life, facing the same challenges, trying to navigate the same waters. So this is something that comes up in the workbook. And I think it's maybe a central thesis of Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less by Dr. Braaten. It's the idea that what often gets interpreted as a motivation problem, but we have a child who's not motivated. What would happen if we actually treated it like a mismatch problem instead? And I think that this is a less pathologizing approach. And I think it's a kinder and ultimately more helpful approach than to pin a motivation problem on a child or a teen, but instead to treat it like a mismatch and a problem to be figured out, to be explored, to be understood better. Sometimes that mismatch is across aptitude, pleasure, and practice, right? Sometimes the mismatch exists across those 3 areas where someone might have a lot of skill and they really enjoy doing the thing, but there's a lot of very real, very competing demands on their time. So they're not able to do that or to do it at the level or as much that they would really want to. Sometimes that's the issue. Sometimes the issue, like another combination, could be the aptitude is very good and the pleasure is very good, but the child might have a lot of anxiety or they might be depressed. There could be very real things getting in the way of their practice. They might be talking themselves out of doing the practice, and that could be related to an anxiety process or a depressive process. Another time, though, on the flip side, sometimes the mismatch is interpersonal, and it can be a mismatch between the child and what they find motivating, their intersection of aptitude, pleasure, and practice, and what those well-meaning adults in their lives think their motivation. So their aptitude, their pleasure, their practice should look like. sometimes that is the mismatch that needs to get figured out.
I loved the reframe of mismatch versus unmotivated because just in reframing that, it allows opportunity rather than case being closed. There's an real opportunity here for all of us to find how we align. Interesting to consider also that the system or the family can be a mismatch. And it doesn't mean that the kid doesn't belong, because certainly they do. It's just about really maybe naming what each value is and then imagining how to meld them together. How do I, coming from this camp, support this kid that comes from this camp or has this interest or leads with this value?
That was one of our main goals in writing this workbook. And the pleasure, there was a lot of pleasure in it for me in crafting these activities that comprise the workbook. One of our big goals was to help kids and teens do inventories of their aptitudes, of their pleasures, of their practices. And each of the chapters in the workbook follows a theme from past, present, future, because the past can be a really valuable source of information. It can help us make sense of what's going on right here, right now, and it helps us use everything we've gathered until this very moment about where we might take it from here, what might happen next. And one of our really big goals was to help kids identify this for themselves, but also to get this information into the hands of parents, teachers, coaches, counselors, therapists, because in order to align, we have to get on the same page first. And a big goal of a lot of the activities in the workbook is to elicit this information that now we can do something productive with.
I love that you mentioned counselors. This is a story that anyone who's worked with me for any length of time has heard. I always think back to really early in my career where I met a student who was failing out of school, and by the time I spoke to the parents, I said, I love learning. That's something that's one of my values. I think it's really fun. And so I said, hey, what are some things that we want to put in place to help this student succeed? And the mom looked at me and she was like, school? We're here because we need the student to be kinder to their siblings. And I recognize that value mismatch. So I love that you mentioned that even all of us who participate in a family system are coming in with our own values.
Mhm.
And are there any strategies that you utilize in the therapy room with this lens? Or are there any things that you think our clinician counterparts can keep in mind when it comes to being in alignment in terms of a client's values and passions?
Love this question. And I love that story. Thank you for sharing it. But asking the right questions, that's how we get aligned. We have to get the information first. And I often find myself drawing from ACT strategies increasingly over the past few years and in the course of producing this workbook. And that I talk a lot, regardless of the age of my patients, who range from elementary school age to young adult working in the workforce. That's my range. I talk a lot with everybody about doing what matters. What do you show up for? Like basically, what are your practices through the lens of the Motivation Mindset Workbook? And I listen for things that they are currently doing. And I listen for tension around the things that they're doing. And I listen for tension around things maybe wish they were doing, but aren't doing, or things that maybe they used to do that they're not doing anymore. So I tune into what they're doing, what the practices are, but also that tension around those. And that's usually it's usually there if they're coming to see me, and it definitely gives us something to jump off of.
I love the idea of what they used to do. And I think that seems like such an important clue for some of the kids and families, individuals that we might see, because sometimes there's an inadvertent quashing of something that was going well, either because it was de-incentivized by the system, until you get your math grade up, you can't go to tennis. Or there's a great case study in the book or the original book of a student who, yeah, you can pursue your career interest after college. And then it was like the student kind of stopped doing their schoolwork with maybe a subconscious mindset of, if I don't get into college, then I won't have to go to college. And so there was kind of less effort happening in the classroom at that time too. So I love what were you doing, because it kind of captures all of that. Like when things were going really well, when I felt really good, I was practicing this, I was going to this. These were things that were actually working to boost up some of these things that I didn't like as much. And so without that, I didn't have that buoy to help me stay energized and stay excited about a variety of things.
That's right. I think that's really, really well put, Lorraine. And what you're describing lines up with the intent that we had in sequencing the activities of the workbook, which we put an incredible amount of thought into. But the order that we landed on was activities focused towards the past and kind of mining the past for useful information, thinking about the present, and then pulling those together to plan for the future.
This workbook feels like something that a clinician could work through with a family and pull from, as well as recommend to a family to do on their own if they're there and able to.
That was really our hope. And in the course of writing the activities and working on them with Dr. Braaten and going back and forth with our editors, I learned so much in this process. I'm so grateful for it. But I found myself kind of practicing what I preach and putting some of the activities into practice. I can give a couple of examples. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, that would be awesome.
So throughout elementary, middle, and high school, I played the flute. And I wouldn't say that I played it at a high level. I participated in my school's concert bands. I went to music camp the summer before my senior year of high school, which was a really enriching experience. I would play at a church. Like, it meant a lot to me and I enjoyed it, but I was never in like all state bands or national, like I didn't take it to that level, but I did it and I was good at it. And aptitude, pleasure, and practice really overlapped for me all the way through high school. And then when I got to college, time redistributed.
Mm.
And that's the best way I can put it. Time
Mhm.
redistributed, and I got intimidated. College was a super intimidating time for me. And where that really hit me was in the practice domain. So I really stopped playing and didn't play in any sort of formal way ever since college. And college for me started in 2003. But this past spring, the town where I live in Belmont, Massachusetts, there was an announcement for a community band at the music school that's in town, assembling adult players of all levels of experience to come be a part of a concert band. So this past spring, for the first time in 22 years, I played my flute with regularity. I practiced my flute. I allowed it to bring me pleasure again. And I was able to relearn it and to get some of that aptitude back, and got to perform among about 100 people in this band on stage at the high school at the end of the year concert. It really felt like something had come full circle, and how another example of how the past can be full of useful information that if we can identify it, then it puts us in a position to act on it. And just so grateful that this opportunity presented itself and I was able to connect with something that used to mean a lot and really still does.
Oh, that's so special. I love to hear stories like that. I wonder for you if there were values pieces of being among a community or the performance aspect that made this opportunity particularly motivating.
It sure did. I would say that being a part of something bigger than myself is the value, and connecting with peers, connecting with creatives, connecting with people who care to do a thing.
Hmm.
these are all values too.
Yeah. I I think I see that need to just continue to look a little deeper with athletes sometimes because at face value they think working out is a great way to capture that feeling that they had playing competitive athletics, but there might even be some more aspects to explore, because it's not a quite a match for people sometimes because they're missing that team component. They're missing that goal-oriented community support, whatever it is that they're missing. Sometimes it feels like, oh, the weight room isn't quite capturing that motivation in the same way that sports did or playing on my team did.
That's a great example. And you're absolutely right. It's like it's adjacent, right? It's close, but it's not quite. I feel like that was another one of our goals in designing the activities the way that we did, kind of working with an underlying assumption that kids are probably, our readers, our kids and teens, are probably doing a lot of adjacent things, but maybe we need to do a little tuning or turn the dial to find that values match or to find that pleasure match. Like we're probably close, but maybe there's room to fine tune it.
One of the ways that I think about self-care is values oriented. As I'm thinking through this, things kind of align. And to really be nurturing yourself, this might really be helpful to figure out what to do on a weekend, for example, to go back into the week feeling like energized and not like, I don't know what I did when somebody asks. This feels like really important information to have at any stage for different reasons.
Thank you. Our hope, too, is that while the activities are designed to appeal to ages 8 to 16, we're really hopeful that the adults, presumably the adults purchasing the book, introducing it to the kids in their lives, whether it's a personal relationship or a professional one, that there's going to be something in it for the adults too. And as I mentioned before, I found myself drawing from both the activities, but also from the larger principles of aptitude, pleasure, and practice, both as I was writing and preparing the book, but even now to take care of myself.
Yeah. Quick little maybe deviation. I know that you've done a lot of research with autism and neurodivergent folks. D- Um, how might you think about some of this work in terms of that population? Or are there any elements that might be helpful when it comes to motivation with clients who identify as autistic?
Thank you for asking this great question. I would like to think that the workbook is applicable and helpful and has something to offer a lot of different readers, ideally any reader, including those who are neurodiverse, including those who have autism, including those who have ADHD. And I'm thinking about what we know about autism and how often an aspect of autism is having a really, really deep interest and how that really lends itself to pleasure. And I'm thinking too about the neuropsych testing work that I do. That's a large part of my professional activity and how my autistic patients have some of the most unique and complex cognitive profiles and how identifying those aptitudes is so, so important and how important it is for folks who are neurodiverse to have time and space to do the things that matter to them, to do their deep dives, right? To engage with the things they want to learn about and that they really care about, that they have a strong capacity for, that bring them a lot of pleasure when they engage with them. I think identifying and honoring those is really important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And they might be attuned to what motivates them and they might be clear on that. And it might be a permission slip for the system upon looking at it through this lens to say, do it. Good. That's great. Love to see you have this interest. Go carve out time for it. Go work on that.
I think that's really, really well put. I guess the heart of the workbook is to orient people towards action and towards doing what matters. It is never meant to snuff out anyone's light, right? Or to direct anyone away from the things that really do matter. It's really quite the opposite. Finding the things that matter and honoring that, not trying to argue with fact, right? But honoring what's true and then nurturing it with time and space and support.
Yeah. Can I give you maybe a quick little scenario and how it might often be handled? And then you might be able to offer, like, pulling from your work here, what might be an outcome we could hope for instead. I'm just thinking of, I used the math grade example earlier, but
Yes.
um, student getting reasonable, like maybe C's in math, the family thinks that they could do better and spends a lot of time focusing on raising that grade, incentivizing it any way that they can. And they're adding in extra tutoring, extra supports. And so now the kid doesn't just have an hour a day that they're kind of dreading, but they have like probably multiple hours of the day that they're kind of dreading since they just really aren't as fond of math and they really have a passion for painting.
This is a great example. And absolutely the kind of scenario that could sound sirens like, oh, not motivated, not motivated. But here's how I would think about it. I would be thinking about it through the lenses of aptitude, pleasure, and practice as a way of understanding the C level grades in math. Sometimes a formal evaluation is the thing that can really help clarify those things. I would be wondering if the child has always had difficulties with math or if this is a new issue,
Mhm.
because the answer to that question, I think, would guide my thinking further. For instance, if this were historically an issue, I would really be pushing for an evaluation. Does this child have either a math disability or something going on with their visual spatial skills, their fluid reasoning skills, their working memory skills? Is there something going on in their profile that is making math inordinately hard? And especially so as the math is getting harder and harder. So
Mhm.
that's how I would think about it through aptitude. I would think about it through pleasure. Maybe there's some baked in assumptions that math is not pleasurable, but let's not assume. That's another one of the main messages of this book. Well-intentioned brains assume things because that's what they're wired to do. Let's try not to. Let's try to collect and work with data instead. And with practice, in your example, I'm thinking about how tutoring got added into the mix and how that can be a very appropriate support and solution if someone is not doing well in math. I would wonder where that time was coming from. If someone is now engaging with a math tutor, my big question would be, well, where did that time come from? And if it came from tennis, to go back to the earlier example, that would be really sad. I would hate to see that happen. If it were my patient, I would do anything I could to make sure that the extra time for math was not taken away from tennis. And
It's a great awareness, the timepiece. Yeah.
in this example too, the painting, that especially if someone is putting in the extra work and the extra time, the extra practice, for instance, here in working with a math tutor to try to increase their math skills and in turn increase their math grade, that's probably hard work. It might not be super pleasurable. I would be looking for infusions of pleasure in order to do something about this hard but arguably necessary work that's now a part of the picture to address the math. If we're carving out time for extra math, again, if this were my patient, I would be strongly encouraging protecting time already in place for tennis and carving out time for painting too, if that's a
Mm,
new interest or a new pleasure. Because if you have time for math, you have time for pleasure too.
wow. One quick follow-up question about that. I know I'm making this sound like I'm living this scenario. I'm just making it up. But an adult might say, well, math stinks, but we all have to do it. Math isn't fun, obviously. From this perspective of the acronym, do you think there's value in keeping it more neutral, not providing language that math isn't pleasurable and just saying, I know it takes a lot of work for you and I see that you're working really hard?
I love that question. It's a really, really good point. And it does tie into something that Ellen writes in Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less, that there are some things that we have to do. And it seems like the older we get, the more of them there are that we have to do. that are not pleasurable, but they are important. And sometimes they're important for doing the other things that do bring us pleasure. And I think math is one of those for a lot of students. Reading can certainly be that for a lot of students, especially if they have a reading disability like dyslexia, written expression, where these things are certainly very important. And we're not going to give anyone a free pass on not learning them because we recognize how important they are and how our society requires them. And in order to, in the future, have time and space and capacity to do the things that you're good at, that bring you pleasure, it often requires having a base set of skills that are taught in the early school years. So we acknowledge that, yes, there are some things that have to be learned and that have to be done that might not be pleasurable, yet they are important, yet they are worth doing. And I like your point around math. I would be very careful to let our biases show, whatever they may be, and to teach them to the kids we work with. If we dislike math, I don't, I'll use myself as an example. Calculus was not my thing. It was not my thing, but probability, I loved. Statistics, I loved. That came in handy in graduate school.
Yeah.
How I'm trying to keep that the best that I can to myself when I interact with my kids, try to keep my mind as open as possible that their experiences about everything, including math, but everything else could be very different from mine. And I would like them to form their own opinions and not to be too colored by mine from the get-go. So I do try to do what you were describing, which is keep my language neutral and validate when I hear information being shared with me. My little boy who's 5, writing is tricky for him. Like just the motor coordination involved. And it took a long time. We're still not completely sure if he's going to be a righty or a lefty.
Oh, yeah.
Time will tell. Most kids, by 5, but not my guy. And so when he talks about writing being tricky, I'm like, yeah, man, I see
Yeah, I see it. Yeah. You're working hard.
You are working hard. You are working hard. And think about what you get to do when you know how to write. Think about what kind of fun you get to have when you have a handle on the skill. He recently learned a trick for holding the pen correctly that we learned from his pre-K teacher. Game changer. This was really cute and funny, but recently we set up a new printer and it prints a test page that basically just has a big picture of a printer on it. And he grabbed this and colored it in like it was a coloring sheet. And I'm like, wow, that's probably the least fun coloring sheet ever. But again, I think that this also ties into the idea that motivation is fluid and what can feel unmotivating, undesirable, too hard, not fun, and one moment can change. This is a kid who, before learning that trick for holding a pencil, would never have picked up this printer sheet with a printer on it and colored it in.
Yeah.
So it's all subject to change, which I think is really good news. And that those well-meaning parents, right? The ones who sometimes get in the way of motivation, but can have an incredible role to play in boosting and supporting it. I think the fact that motivation is as malleable as it is really good news for those adults.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much for all of your insight and for the important work that you put into this workbook.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. I really enjoyed our conversation and the chance to introduce something that just means so much to me.
I think this is going to be a really great guide for so many parents, families, and our fellow clinicians. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Self-Carapist podcast. If you did, please subscribe and feel free to leave a review. You can also follow along at The Self-Therapist on Instagram or head to lorrainemoorhead.com/podcast to grab a free copy of your own Learning Map worksheet to help track all of the tools and strategies you're interested in learning more about. See you next Wednesday.